Thank you. Thank you. As Laura mentioned, I've got a soccer game I'm going to try to get down to, and so if I leave when I'm done, it's really because I'm not sure whether it was a good speech or a bad speech. I'm fleeing just in case there isn't any applause. That's not really it. I'm leaving because I'm trying to get home to see my son's soccer game. I have a senior in high school and a freshman in high school, and then I have one in college. And we're in the playoffs tonight. Bowling Green's playing Greenwood, and so I'm hoping to get back home to see them play. Y'all may have heard of it was this little girl, and she wanted $100. And her parents said, well, ask God for things that you want, and he'll deliver. And so she wrote a letter to God. Dear God, I'd really like $100. I'll do good things with it. So she sent it off, and the postmaster got it, and the postmaster said, wow, that's really cute. What should we do with this letter? And he said, let's send it to the president. So they sent the letter to the president, and he said, well, that's really cute. And the president said to his secretary, send her $5. She'll think that's a lot of money. So she got the $5, and she was like, well, her parents always told her to write a thank you. And so she wrote a thank you. She said, dear God, thanks for the money, but next time don't send it through Washington. They stole 95% of it. I'd like you for a second to imagine a world where there's no disease, no disability, no hardship. All of it's been eliminated. No meningitis, no Down syndrome, no cleft palate, no cerebral palsy. Man is able now to select against these disabilities. Each individual's biological future can be predicted by their DNA. You think to yourself, well, gosh, wouldn't that be great if disease were eliminated? But in the next thought, you're thinking to yourself, what's he really talking about? Is he talking about selecting out individuals? Is he talking about who will live and who will die and making these decisions? Who would make these decisions, and should we make these decisions? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this wouldn't have even been something we would have conceived of because we didn't understand DNA enough to know. Now they've mapped the whole genome. You can tell whether your pet is a Labradoodle by sending a swab of DNA to a company. So your DNA is known, and ultimately they are going to know your future from before you're born. What will your potential be? Are we willing to live in a world, though, where we're going to make decisions before someone's born about what their future is, and do we think we have the right to make those decisions? Voluntarily or non-voluntarily. There's a movie from about 10 or 15 years ago which even precedes some of this knowledge called Gattaca. In Gattaca, everything's predetermined. You don't interview for jobs. You take a blood sample and your DNA is looked at. That's how they determine whether you get the job or not. From the very beginning, they know whether you'll succeed or not. Vincent Freeman is the hero or the main character in the movie Gattaca. He's born the old-fashioned way. They've started doing it where they select out and you're selected and everybody's supposed to get this perfect genome. But he's born at the cusp of this, and he has old-fashioned way, and he has imperfect DNA. He is known from the very beginning to be of high intellect, but he also is known to have a heart defect, and he's going to live to be 30.2 years old. But his dream is he wants to be an astronaut. But you can't be an astronaut if you're going to live to be 30.2, if your DNA is imperfect. So in this society, in Gattaca, there are people who become borrowed ladders, people who try to cheat the system. It's patrolled, the police make the decisions, but they try to trick them. So what you do, if you can afford it, is you buy someone's DNA. So he finds a guy who had perfect DNA, championship swimmer, everything was perfect about him, just like me, 6'4", handsome. Oh no, that was somebody else who had perfect DNA. But this guy was perfect, and so he steals his DNA to try to become an astronaut. In order to do it, he has to have fake fingertips with the guy's blood underneath there because they're tested every day as they go through. He has contact lenses that have fake iris maps on them, so when he goes through the iris scanner, he's trying to cheat the system because he has imperfect DNA. As he goes forward, he trains for this mission, and he's not very good at the physical aspect of it, but he keeps tricking the system, and he's making his way through. And he gets selected for a manned flight to the moon Titan off of the planet Saturn. It's going to be a several-year-long mission. But as he goes forward, and he's going forward through his flight, he doesn't bring any fluid samples, no blood or no urine sample, because he thinks he's done. He thinks he's home free and he's getting on the rocket ship. But in the last minute, as he comes forward, there's one doctor there waiting, and they ask him to give a urine sample. He doesn't have a fake one to give, and he gives his own. This doctor is somebody he'd encountered before, and the doctor's always been wanting to tell him something about his son, but he's never gotten quite to the story. As the urinalysis is read, it comes out that he's not who he is. He's not who he says he is, and he's going to be denied his trip into space. But as he does, the doctor looks at him, and the doctor says, "My son was born the old-fashioned way. My son has imperfect DNA." And he crumples up the paper, smiles, and he says, "You're on your way." The reason I tell that story is imagine that kind of world. Imagine a China with a one-child policy. Imagine the eugenics that you've heard of from the regimes of old, where things are decided by a state. But then imagine that it's not forced on you, but imagine it's even voluntary. Do you want to voluntarily make those decisions about your children before they're born? Who lives and who dies based on their DNA, based on their genome? Some of you may remember Francis Crick. He was one of the co-discoverers of DNA. He got so consumed by this and so consumed by what he thought were the benefits of knowing DNA that he said, really, this should not be used just in advance of birth because you might miss out on some imperfections. Francis Crick proposed that humans not get their ability or their right to live until they're 1 year of age so we can find out if there are other imperfections. You can see where this can go if this is the theory or this is the belief system we have, that we are the ones that are going to strive for perfection, that man has the ability to perfect things. I think even Nobel laureates succumb to the perfection or to the lure of perfection. The question I ask is, will we be sorry? Will we be sorry when we get to that point? Will we be sorry when we begin to eliminate people? Because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about potential, we're talking about individuals. These people become individuals. Will we be sorry when we eliminate Christy Brown? Christy Brown had severe cerebral palsy. He was born in Dublin to a large, loving Catholic family. For the first several years, they had no idea if he had any potential. And finally, at age 5, they see him on the floor in the kitchen next to his sister who was learning to read and write, and he picks up with his left foot, the only part of his body that he can move, picks up with his left foot a piece of chalk and writes the letter A. He went on to be an author, a novelist, a poet with severe cerebral palsy. Do we want to make the decision that we are going to become the ones who decides who's perfect, who's imperfect, and we're going to make these decisions? What would the world be like if we decide that those who have less than perfect hearing should be eliminated, should not be allowed to be born? Does anybody remember a composer who by the age of 26 has begun to lose most of his hearing? Probably one of the world's greatest composers, Beethoven. Is this the kind of world we want to live in? Will we be sorry when we eliminate those with cleft palate? Will we be sorry when we eliminate those susceptible to Lou Gehrig's disease, like Stephen Hawking? Will we be sorry when we eliminate people who are susceptible to blindness, like Helen Keller? Wouldn't it be the ultimate irony if we decide we're going to perfect the human race by only having those with good DNA be born? Wouldn't it be the irony that some epidemic occurs and we have eliminated from our old genome the protective DNA that we might have needed to survive? But just imagine, is that the world we want to live in? Would we perhaps eliminate in the process some part of our humanness, some part of our specialness, if we seek perfection? Will we be flying too close to the sun? Will we, in our search for perfection, have an Icarus moment? You remember Icarus? He flies too close to the sun and the wings melt. Last year I came home from Israel with a hymn in my head, "How Great Thou Art." Stuck in my head. For some reason, I woke up with it in my head, went to sleep with it. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. I think when we sing the message of life, when our message is sung and brought forth with optimism and with hope, then I think we will begin to win the battle for life. When we convince people of the uniqueness of life, when we persuade people that the disdain that they direct towards a clump of cells should really be the awe that these cells, that this master nucleus and DNA, the awe should be that this becomes a human being. Einstein once said there are two ways we can look at life. We can look at life as if nothing is a miracle or as if everything is a miracle. I choose the latter. As a physician, I've seen life from the very beginning to the very end. It's not all easy, it's not all pretty. I've seen the tragedy of disease, I've seen the face of suffering, and I've seen death. Many of you have in your lives as well. But I do see the joy and I see the hope. And I particularly see it as new young babies have come into the world, as I delivered babies as a medical student. My family has a long history of being pro-life OBGYNs. My little sister's an OBGYN. My dad's an OBGYN. My little sister says that there is truly power in the ultrasound, in showing people images, that people are persuaded by images, that young women who come into the clinic where she volunteers are persuaded by the image on the ultrasound. My dad tells the story of a woman who was contemplating abortion. He didn't perform abortions, but she came in to see him, and he did an ultrasound. He said, let's just show you the pictures. Ultrasounds were new at that time. There's still a fascination with pictures of children before they're born. But he showed her an ultrasound, and it turned out to be twins. And she made the decision to keep them after seeing the images. While some legislatures have failed to talk about or failed to succeed with having ultrasounds, George Will writes, and put it well when he said, "Do the people objecting to such laws object to the graphic images we put on cigarette packages?" So if we can put images on cigarette packages to deter you from smoking, you think at the very least we could have images of babies to deter people from abortion. I think technology is helping us to win this battle. I think babies are surviving earlier and earlier. And as they are, we're seeing little arms and legs in these pictures, and I think it's harder for people to be flippant about life. I remember when my wife became pregnant. At 8 weeks, we happened to be in Texas, and my dad did an ultrasound for us. And at 8 weeks, we could see my first child. We could see him, his fists going away, and we could see his heart beating at 8 weeks. In my career, I've examined babies often small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. I've examined babies a little over 1 pound on a routine basis. We examine them for a disease called retinopathy of prematurity. In the old days, when this wasn't checked for, these babies that were born prematurely often went on to blindness. But as I see these babies in the neonatal nursery, nobody comes up to me and says, who are their parents, before we decide whether or not we're going to take care of them, whether or not they deserve to be medically treated, whether their life is deserving. Nobody asks how they were conceived. Nobody asks who their parents were. It's just not an issue. Nobody also asks whether or not the state has a role. I don't know of anybody, whether you're on our side of this issue or the other side of the issue, that believes that there is not some role for the state in protecting the welfare of children. So to me, this isn't about all the other extraneous stuff that people want to get trapped in and people want to trap pro-life people in just to see us wriggle. It really is about when life begins. Because when life begins, life should be protected, and the state has a role in that. The debate over when life begins, I think, can only be really settled at conception. I believe life begins at conception, and that's why I've introduced the Life Begins at Conception Act, and will continue to do so. One of the things that I think when people point to whether or not, those who say, oh, well, it's not life, it's just something meaningless there. I think one of the things that takes them back that also comes from technology is the fact that babies inside the uterus can now be operated on without harming the mother and with saving the life of the baby. We've, I believe, repaired neural tube defects as well as blocked kidneys. But the one interesting thing, or the thing that interests me about this, is that you can operate on a baby at 20 weeks gestation inside the womb, but you can't do it unless you give the baby anesthesia. The baby feels pain. And I think when you tell people that and they want to disregard and say, oh, it's no big deal, 20 weeks, you can still have an abortion at 20 weeks, but you can't operate on the baby because the baby won't hold still because the baby feels pain. I think these are potent arguments, and sometimes we get trapped too much in the pro-life movement, but I think technology is on our side, and speaking of these things in a rational way is on our side. When I finished medical school, I took the Hippocratic Oath. Part of the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm. Now, some would argue, well, a lot of physicians aren't paying attention to this. I think that's true, but I think we're also missing the boat in thinking that a lot of physicians are performing abortions. Very few are, actually. It's a small number, and if you ask physicians, if this group were all physicians, over 90, maybe 95% kind of don't like the concept or wouldn't do it or didn't choose to go into it or don't want to participate in it. First, do no harm. I think they see it as doing harm. So I think when we think about how do we move forward, there's laws. Laws ought to be changed. There's a role for the state. But there's also a role for persuasion. There's a role for the point where we talk about making something socially unacceptable. My guess is in Owensboro that can turn out a dinner like this, that it is socially unacceptable. So that's part of what you do as a community. That's part of what your church does. That's part of what you represent in a community, is deciding what is normal, deciding what the norm is. And I think that's an important thing. And sometimes we lose track of that because we're always fixated on how we're going to change something. But you deciding that it's unacceptable in your community is important. And I think in doing so, we are having an impact. And I think things are changing for the positive. Because I think sometimes we get depressed and we say, we've been trying forever to overturn Roe v. Wade and we never get there. I'm not saying we stop, but I'm saying that we look at all of the other things that can happen positive that we can affect. Ultrasound. Talking about pain, talking about trying to have rules against harming babies in the womb. One of our goals, though, among others, needs to be how we present this. I'll never forget in college having a physics professor, and you don't often hear a science professor in the middle class interrupt the class to say something, but he interrupted the class at one point to say that his son who was very intellectually gifted, also had spina bifida and was paralyzed. And he told us about his son because he wanted us to cherish the specialness of life and to realize that life comes in all sizes, shapes, and packages. In between talk of Planck's constant and quantum physics, he spent a brief moment talking about his son. It was important to him that he get this message across to us. I might not have heard this at any other school, but I went to Baylor, which was a school where science and God's law were not mutually exclusive and where scientific wonder reinforced the idea of miracle. Robert Henry is a painter, and he wrote in instructing young painters about that they should paint like a man coming over the hills singing. I like the image of that. Paint like a man coming over the hills singing. That sort of sense of optimism. To me, it also, when I think about how we should present our message doesn't have to be fire and brimstone. All right, maybe a little bit of fire and brimstone, but it doesn't have to be all fire and brimstone. It needs to be hope. It needs to be optimism. It needs to be that we care about the mother and the child. I think when we get that message and we bring it forward like a man coming over the hill singing, when we bring our message forward like the hymn says, then sings my soul. When we bring that message forth in a happy and optimistic way, I think we're going to win this battle. This battle isn't going to be over anytime soon. I don't think any of you think this is a month-long battle. But when the message resounds with joy and hope, when the message is full of children's laughter, when the public perceives our concerns for the child and the mother, then and only then will the public rise up and choose life. Only when society says no to a culture that wantonly discards life as if it were an unwanted shoe, only when we sing out and when we sing this with a joyful voice will we win the battle. I hope and pray that that day comes sooner rather than later. I would until that day, I will continue to do all I can to protect, proclaim, and do everything within my possible functions as a U.S. Senator to protect the right to life. Thank you very much.